Hello everyone. I want to spend a little time summarizing for you the Civil War and Reconstruction. Most historians agree that the Civil War was the biggest single event in American history, and since our class starts right after the Civil War ends, it's important that we know a little bit about the Civil War. If you want to pause the video and write down the things on this timeline and kind of take some notes as we go through this lecture, you're welcome to. You're not going to be tested on this material. This is just to kind of give you a jumping off point for where American history since 1877 begins. Now, the Civil War radically altered the nation in many ways. The United States became a unified nation because of the war. Before the war, people would often say the United States are, and after the war, people would say the United States is. So there's this change in the way citizens refer to their country. The phrase the United States are implies the country is made up of individual states. The phrase the United States is refers to the country as one entity. So the way Americans saw their country changed from a union of states to one of a nation. Now, I don't think that the divisiveness goes away after the Civil War and Reconstruction. There's a lot of divisiveness over the Civil War that bleeds into the 1870s, 1880s, and 1890s. Now, some of the most important constitutional amendments were passed during the Civil War and right after. The 13th Amendment abolished slavery. The 14th Amendment declared that blacks are citizens of the United States. And the 15th Amendment gave black men the right to vote. The idea that secession could take place was killed. You know, the South seceded to start the Civil War, and the North went to war to say you cannot secede from the Union. The Union is perpetual. Because of war, the South lay in total ruins after the Civil War ended. The United States has never faced a total war or experienced total war except for the South. They had cities in ruins. They had, their plantations and farms were in ruins. There were refugees, both black and white, all over the South. So the South has experienced total war. Conscription happened for the first time in American history. The amount of money the government spent went through the roof during the Civil War. The size of the federal government increased. Civil liberties were violated during the Civil War. America experienced the first assassination of a president when Lincoln was killed in April of 1865. America had its first impeachment. After the Civil War, the Republicans impeached the Democrat president, Andrew Johnson, but the Senate failed to remove him from office. There's a whole host of other changes that occurred, but those are just some of the more basic ones. Now, a lot has been written on the Civil War. In the 150 years since the Civil War occurred, more than 50,000 books, papers, pamphlets have been written about the Civil War. Basically, since the Civil War started, a book, pamphlet, or paper a day has been written on the Civil War. So that means you could spend your whole life reading about the Civil War and still not exhaust all the material there is on the Civil War. And just to illustrate that, I've got a picture here. This is a tower of Abraham Lincoln books. This tower is 35 feet high. It has a circumference of 8 feet. There's something like 7,000 books in this tower. It's estimated that there are up to 15,000 books written about Abraham Lincoln. So this tower doesn't even represent all the books. So you could spend a lot of time reading and still have way more to read if you wanted to learn a lot. If you want to learn more about the Civil War, I do teach a class on it. It's called History 1461, Military History of the American Civil War. We spend a whole semester just studying the Civil War. We have a great textbook on it. We learn about battles, about political controversies, how the average American citizens dealt with the Civil War. So I would recommend that class if you want to learn more about the war. Now, just some basic facts about the war. The Civil War was fought from 1861 to 1865. The war was between 22 northern and middle states and western states who decided against secession. They fought 11 states in the South that seceded and formed the Confederate States of America. Abraham Lincoln was president during the Civil War. He's the most important political figure during the Civil War. And as we study this class, American history, Keep in mind that during the 1870s, 1880s, and 1890s, Americans remembered Abraham Lincoln. They remembered him being killed. They remembered the horrors of the Civil War. They remember the divisiveness of the Civil War. So just think of the Civil War as casting a long shadow over the latter part of the 1800s. The two main theaters in the Civil War were the Eastern Theater and then the Western Theater. If you look at this map, you can kind of see where the Eastern Theater was. That's where Robert E. Lee did most of his fighting. The Western Theater is where Ulysses S. Grant did most of his fighting. And then after Ulysses S. Grant defeated most of the Confederate armies in the West, he was sent east to take on Robert E. Lee, and he spent 1864 and 1865 fighting Robert E. Lee in Virginia and ended up defeating him and then winning the Civil War. If you added up all the small engagements up to the largest battles of the Civil War, there would be about 10,000 engagements that occurred. 360,000 Yankees died fighting for the North. Between 2.1 and 2.2 million men served in the Union armies during the war. Somewhere around 260,000 rebels died fighting for the Confederacy. Somewhere between 750,000 and 1 million men served in the Confederate armies during the war. The total number killed was 620,000, with 1.1 million men wounded. Now that's military men, that's not civilians. If you include civilians, the number is much higher, but we don't really know how many there are. Now that 620,000, that's a number from an 1889 study. A more recent study estimates that somewhere around 850,000 Americans were killed in the Civil War. If you use that 620,000 as your base, about 1.94% of Americans were killed in the Civil War. Now, if you look at this chart, you can basically see the Civil War is the bloodiest conflict in American history as far as the rate of death for those who fought. Now, like I said, the Civil War is very costly. In 1860, the federal government spent $63 million. That's the year before the war starts. In the last year of the war, 1865, the federal government had a budget of $1.3 billion. It's estimated that the North spent about $6 billion on the war. Now, the war was especially costly to the South. 2/3 of their assessed wealth was wiped out. Now, most of that's in slaves because slavery was ended, and most of the South's wealth was wrapped up in slavery. 1/4 of white males of military age died in the South, with another 1/4 maimed. 2/5 of the South's livestock was killed. More than 1/2 of the South's farm machinery was destroyed. Southern railroads, industry, the city, the countryside was destroyed. You know, Atlanta lay in ruins, Richmond lay in ruins. The South was occupied by Union armies during and after the Civil War. Now, one thing I like to do to show you just how big of a deal the Civil War was is to kind of play with some of the numbers. Like I said, we had 620,000 killed during the Civil War. The population of the United States in 1860 was 31 million people. Now that included 4 million slaves. So let's assume that today the population of the United States is 330 million. If you take that 1.94% that were killed during the Civil War and apply it to today's numbers, that means that over 6 million Americans would be killed if we had a civil war of equal destruction occur today. And I like to look at 3 battles just to show you a little bit more so you kind of can wrap your mind around how big of a deal the Civil War was. The single bloodiest day of fighting in the Civil War and all of American history was the Battle of Antietam. This took place in September of 1862 in Maryland. Union casualties were 2,000 killed, over 9,000 wounded, and over 1,000 missing, for a total casualty number of 12,469 out of 75,000 engaged. Confederate casualties were 2,700 killed, over 9,000 wounded, and 2,000 missing. Their total casualties were 13,274 out of 40,000 engaged. So total casualties at Antietam on both sides were just over 25,000. If you fought a battle of that magnitude today, it would mean that just over 1.2 million Americans would be engaged in battle. Over 50,000 would be killed. Almost 200,000 would be wounded. Over 32,000 would be missing. The total casualty rate would be over 278,000. The biggest battle of the Civil War was the three-day battle at Gettysburg. This took place in July of 1863. Union casualties were 3,100 killed, over 14,000 wounded, and over 5,000 missing, for a total of 23,000 casualties out of 85,000 engaged. Confederate casualties at Gettysburg were 2,500 killed, 12,000 wounded, and over 5,000 missing. Their total casualties were 20,451 out of 65,000 engaged. So the total casualties on both sides added up to 43,500. And some historians have said that number is a little low. It's actually just about 50,000 casualties at the three-day Battle of Gettysburg. If you fought that today, that means about 1.6 million Americans would be engaged in battle. Over 61,000 Americans would be killed. Almost 300,000 would be wounded. Over 110,000 would go missing, for a total casualty of 463,000. Now, one of the bloodiest instances of the Civil War happened in 1864 in Virginia. This was Grant's assault against Lee's lines at Cold Harbor. In less than 1 hour, Grant suffered 7,500 casualties. Now, that's not all killed, but a large number of those were killed. So in today's numbers, that would be like 80,000 casualties in less than 1 hour. And I think a good way to wrap your mind around that is the equivalent of 27 9/11 attacks occurring in less than 1 hour. So think about how shocking that would be to have 27 9/11 style attacks occur at the same time in less than an hour. So that kind of gives you, I guess, an introduction into the Civil War. And after the Civil War came Reconstruction. I won't really go into Reconstruction, but basically what Reconstruction is from about 1863 to 1877, as the North is conquering the South, the North says, let's bring the South back into the Union. So the process of Reconstruction is bringing the Southern states back into the Union. Now, Reconstruction kind of ends in 1877. There's an election in 1876. The Republican candidate Rutherford B. Hayes defeats, well, it's not for sure who wins, but Rutherford B. Hayes challenges Samuel J. Tilden, the Democrat, for the presidency in 1876. Now, the election is really close. What happens is South Carolina, Florida, and Louisiana all have contested votes. Nobody knows which way those states voted. Did they vote for the Republican or the Democrat? Basically, what ends up happening is the electoral votes of those states are given to the Republican, and he may have secretly promised that in exchange for giving him those votes that would make him president, he promised to withdraw Union troops from the South. Union troops had been in the South since during the Civil War, and after Union troops are withdrawn from the South is redeemed. That means the South goes back to white Democrat control. There were a lot of Southern states during Reconstruction who had Republican governments. They had blacks elected to the House and to the Senate. They had black state officials. There were black officials at the national level. As long as the Union Army is in the South, they can enforce voting rights, so blacks get to vote in large numbers. But after the 1876 election, the federal troops are withdrawn from the South, and that's when you start having lots of intimidation, and pretty soon it's not really safe to vote in the South if you're black. So the Republicans lose power in the South, and the Democrats take over. That's basically what it means when the South is redeemed. So that's kind of just an introduction to where this class is when we start studying American history. So I look forward to getting to study American history with all of you, and hopefully you'll learn a lot in this class.